Lord, take our minds and think through them, take our lips and speak through them, take our hearts and set them on fire with love for you. Amen. I want to give a little historical background footnote to the reading we just read from the Gospel, so that you'll understand maybe a little bit more about what Jesus was doing when he went around turning over all those tables. The temple in Jerusalem was a place where Jews of his time believed God dwelt. And so there were special pilgrimages throughout the year, and Passover was one of those pilgrimages for them to come. And a part of their worship in the temple involved the sacrifice of animals for different reasons. They were for different things that you were praying to God. It would be a different animal sacrifice. It might be a dove. It might be a pigeon if you couldn't afford a dove. Passover, what would the animal have been? The lamb, the Passover lamb. And these were offered. They were then burnt, actually cooked. And then part of the meat was given to the priests, and that was part of what they ate, and part of it you took home and ate. So it is important to remember that animal sacrifice wasn't just about needlessly killing animals. They killed the animals and they ate the animals, and in that way they had offered them to God, and in thanksgiving for the animal and in thanksgiving to God and in prayer to God for whatever it was, and the animal came back to them. So the temple was set up. It was mostly an outdoor structure, but there was the indoor sort of area that was the Holy of Holies. That's called the sanctuary, and only the priests could go in there. Then there was a court of the temple that was for the male Jews. And there was a court of the temple that was for the female Jews. And then there was a court of the temple that was for the Gentiles, those who were not born into a Hebrew family and yet were converting to Judaism. And it was in this court of the Gentiles that this takes place. Now, if you have come from, say, Circleville to here, walking all the way, how easy would it be to bring your lamb with you? Not two, would it? Or even a pigeon or a dove. So typically, people would wait till they got to Jerusalem, and they would buy the lamb or the pigeon or the dove when they got there, so that they could do what they were doing in terms of their religious observance and their relationship to God. The other thing they did when they were there was they paid their temple tax, kind of like our pledge, except they were told what to pay instead of getting to choose for themselves. And those coins, the coins that they normally had in their pocket, issued by the Roman government, had the picture of Caesar on it and the inscription that said, "Caesar, son of God." So these were not appropriate coins to use to pay your religious temple tax, your pledge, because it claimed Caesar as God as opposed to God as God. So they changed those coins. The temple minted their own coins, and you would exchange your Roman coins for the temple coins. So that's what's going on. One of the things that Jesus gets so upset about is the way these things were, the way the poor people that had traveled so far were being exploited. What happens if you really want to go to an OSU game and you don't have any tickets and nobody gave you any, and you just went there? All right, can you get a ticket?
Oh, yeah.
About how much does it cost?
A lot.
A lot more than a ticket would. That's what these folks were doing. They had them. They were there. They needed whatever they needed to have to pay their taxes. They also their temple tax. They also needed their animal for the religious observance, and so they had them. So they were charging these poor people who were already exploited by the Romans. They were charging them. Their own people were exploiting them even more and charging them outrageous amounts for this. So Jesus is really mad about that. But he's also really mad about a whole religious system that exploited people in this way, that made it very expensive to have a relationship with God. And so he turned the tables over, all over the place, and sent things scattered. Now, when I read that story and was kind of getting into it for my sermon, the phrase turning the tables kept coming up. And I thought, wow, wouldn't it be cool if that expression, turning the tables, actually came from this story? So I Googled it. And guess what? It does not. It has nothing to do with this story. What it does have to do with, it actually comes from from a couple of different places. One, board games like chess and backgammon, where it kind of matters which way the board is facing you. And that in a play, somebody would turn the table and make it face the other way. But maybe even more importantly, another place it comes from, this expression of turning the tables, is in formal dinner parties, a long time ago, old-fashioned dinner parties. Think the set of Downton Abbey, for example, okay? You got the long table and everybody's all dressed up and all the silver and everything's out. You've got guests down the side, and you've got the host at one end, and you got the hostess at the other end. Well, at that table, the hostess would start a conversation, usually with somebody on her right, and everybody else somebody on one side of them, they would start a conversation with. And at some point during the dinner, the hostess would switch. She would change the conversation. She would turn the table. She would start talking to the person on her left, and that was a signal for all the other guests to find a different conversation partner. Usually just the person on the other side of it, whichever side that was. And that was called turning the table. Well, that's pretty interesting. Because when Jesus turned over all those tables at the temple, one of the things he was doing was changing the conversation. He was changing the conversation about what it meant to have a relationship with God. And I think that may be important for us, because I have this feeling that Jesus may be turning tables in the life of the church today in the same way of changing the conversation. For several years now, we in the church have been having conversations about how in the world to get people back into church so that church can go back to what we remember it as being. And a lot of times these are the boomers that are remembering it a certain way from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but not all the time. Some of you younger folks have memories of that too, or maybe you've just seen too many movies with churches in it. But for so long, the conversation has been, how do we get people back? How do we get it back so we can be what we used to be? And we sort of have in mind this church of the 50s, 60s, or 70s, when all those big buildings were being built, when you had so many baby boomer kids that the Sunday school rooms were overflowing, and everything was overflowing. School classrooms were overflowing, and there were a lot of us in the baby boomer generation. And so it just was this influx of kids into the church, and it was in the days when you didn't decide whether you were going to go to church on a Sunday or not. You might decide which church you went to, but it was assumed you were going to go to some church if you were Christian or had been brought up Christian. If you were Jewish, you were going to go to some synagogue, on Friday night or Saturday. So we have this sort of yearning, and the conversation's been a lot about that. What if Jesus is turning the tables? What if Jesus is changing that conversation? What if Jesus might be changing the question from the question of how do we get those people back to how do we follow Jesus outside of the building? I have a friend who likes to use the phrase, Jesus has left the building. His name is Peter Keyes. He's a priest in East Tennessee, and he wrote a book by that name recently. Jesus has left the building. Well, it doesn't mean that Jesus isn't in the building also. But if you think back on Jesus' ministry, there were times that he was in wherever the neighborhood synagogue meeting was taking place, which was probably a shop. He was in a building. There were times when he was in the temple building and temple courts. There were times when he taught there. There were times when he healed there. But most of the time, where was Jesus? Out. He was out in the streets, countryside, in the middle of the cities, on the streets. He was out among people, eating dinner with them, building relationships with them, hanging out with folks that he probably shouldn't have been hanging out with, not even necessarily all the time with the people that people would consider his own people, or who should be his own people. He was out there. He was out. So what if Jesus is turning the tables on us and changing the question to us as a church, not just as individuals, but to us as a congregation, to this question: how do we begin to tell where Jesus is leading us outside of the building? And maybe a follow-up question: and what can I do to help us get there? Lots of people are writing, thinking, talking about that very thing. The main subject yesterday at Clergy Day, people telling stories about how their congregation is trying to do that. And so in all the mainline congregations, not just Episcopal and Lutheran, but in Methodist, Presbyterian, all these people are asking this kind of question. They're coming up with some very interesting answers. A lot of times the answer has been where we first found it easiest to go outside of our building, and that is doing outreach type work of mission, either on our own as a congregation or in combination with other people, things like the well, or things like trying to work with the Catholic Church in town, with the St. Vincent de Paul chapter. So there's been a lot of times that we've done that already, and so some of it's building on that and just doing more of it. But there's also some different ways that people are finding as a congregation to go outside of the church, to follow Jesus outside of the building. Another way is like our talk at the tavern type things. Those are just catching on all over the country, and some of them are like ours, where we go to a tavern for a few nights scattered throughout the year and have discussions, and we invite the whole community. And that's a great beginning, because even though right now it's mostly Episcopalians and Lutherans, we do have a couple of Roman Catholics, a Methodist retired pastor, and a couple of unchurched people that are regulars, and other people that kind of have come in and out of that. So that's one way of following Jesus outside of the building. And there are other congregations that instead of going to the tavern and doing discussion, have gone to the tavern and used one of the side rooms as a place of worship and had worship there. In fact, there's a church in Westerville, an Episcopal church, St. Matthew's, which split a few years back over social issues, and half of the church left and formed an offshoot of the Episcopal church. And there weren't enough people left in the church to be able to support the building, and so they lost the building. It forced them out of the building. Sometimes I think the Spirit does things like that. That's why I wasn't kidding when I said something about maybe we needed to hear what Tom read before he read the right lesson, or maybe we needed to hear those words of that hymn before we sang the right one. Sometimes the Spirit moves us by forcing us out. So this church no longer had a building. And they bought a house, but it's not big enough for them all to gather, because there are about 50 or 60 of them that are still gathering. So their priest is our diocesan liaison, Joe Kovich. He came last year for one of our Supina movies. So what he did was he and his vestry formed an alliance with a local tavern, because taverns are closed on Sunday mornings. And the tavern has given them a room to use there. They've given them storage space where they keep a portable altar and a reredos, which is kind of like just the back thing where they can hang something that's the color of the season, and chairs. And every Sunday morning they go to the tavern, and the tavern's opened up for them, and they pull out their altar and stuff, and 60 people gather in the tavern for Eucharist. They do right to Eucharist, just like we do. I think they have a piano or so. I don't know how they're doing their music, but they're doing music. They're doing a fairly traditional right to service right there in the tavern every Sunday morning. That's another way. There are churches all over, Lutheran, Episcopal, Catholic, Presbyterian, Methodist, and others that we've considered mainline, that have added as another service on Sunday mornings. A service that is out of the building and down the street in a vacant lot, or some of them that are in suburban areas in a grocery store parking lot. It's called street church, and anybody can come. And some of the ones I know about in Columbus have about 100 people that are coming that are street people. And they come in sometimes for just part and then leave, but most of them stay for the whole thing. And there's a core that keeps coming back of about 100 or so people. And that's their second service each Sunday. They do their service in the building, then they do their service out of the building. Now, I tell you all these things not because we should all run out and start street church and worship in the tavern and do all this. The point isn't about the what. The point is about asking the question. All of these churches asked the question. Some were forced to, but all of them asked the question, where might Jesus be leading us outside of this building? And I think that Jesus is turning the tables on mainline churches. and changing the conversation from how do we get everybody back so we can do it the way we did it in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, to where is Jesus leading us outside of the building, and how can we help our congregation get there. That doesn't mean this goes away. Because that doesn't mean that this doesn't still work. And it doesn't mean that this isn't a place, you know that or you wouldn't be here. It just means this is only part of it. This is only part of it. It would be like if we said, our family has a family meal every Sunday, and then we never did anything else, and we never left the house. This is our Sunday meal, and it's a very important part inside the building. But there are all these other ways that Jesus is outside the building. And so I encourage you as individuals, and I encourage all of you that have leadership roles, let's let that question come up in our conversation. Let's begin to ask, how do we further develop the ways we have already moved outside the building? And what are the other unique ways that Jesus may be moving us to find where he is outside of this building? May it be so.